I am very honored by this invitation, and I would like to thank the organizer of that series. And I will try my best to lay out and summarize some of my approaches and strategies, but I'm afraid I'm not certain that I have any startling revelation to make about teaching methodology. So instead, I propose to present a short narration that will focus on one specific pedagogical experience I've had during my years at Stanford. So if you look at this little visual aid, I propose to talk first about some of the challenges that confronted me when I began my career here as an assistant professor. And I am sure that this brief narrative will be familiar to those among you who, like me, are members of a small department in the School of Humanities. And then my second point, I will explain how I attempted to deal with those challenges and how they helped me define what I will call the psychology of teaching and learning. And by psychology of learning, I refer to three principal issues regarding the transmission of knowledge: what I want my students to learn, what they want and need to learn, and how they are best going to learn. And to illustrate my views on the psychology of learning, I will focus on a particular course that was just mentioned in the very kind introduction, a course dealing with medieval synth lives, and I will briefly retrace its evolution and development up to now. And my final point, on the basis of this specific pedagogic experience, I will propose a summary of some of the methods and strategies I developed in order to meet, as best I can, the needs and expectations of an eclectic audience. So my first point is the challenges in teaching the medieval period. Because that I ever came to deal with an eclectic audience may come as a surprise, at least it does to me, if one considers the rather esoteric labels that define my position here. First, my affiliation is the French department. Second, my official specialty is French literature in the Middle Ages. And third, my area of research is French culture in the 12th and 13th centuries. And you can well imagine the type of appeal that French culture in the 12th and 13th centuries hold nowadays. It's fair to say that the interest for that period is not particularly great among our undergraduate students. Some of the challenges I faced as I arrived at Stanford were how to introduce my public to a not particularly well-known period of cultural history, how to attract the attention of students for literary works that are in the main alien to them, remote, difficult to read, and esoteric, and how to present a series of authors and listening communities whose values, modes of writing, and subject matters differ greatly from what we call modernity. And let me add that I am still facing other more specific challenges. One is the fact that I am French, as you may have guessed by now, and that I must reconcile my public to the acoustic strangeness of my accent, or that I must reconcile myself to my own accent, for on that subject, students are by and large of extreme indulgence or admirable indifference. Another challenge is the fact that I am hard of hearing, which creates a difficulty in understanding the questions posed during class time or discussion time. And all of those challenges combined are integral to the pedagogical method I developed during my years at Stanford. For example, to compensate for my accent, I generally distribute handouts like this one, that I hope you all have, to help my audience follow the main points of my argument and to provide them with the proper names or unfamiliar vocabulary potentially contained in my lectures. To compensate for my hearing problem, I generally divide the class into smaller sections during discussion time. But the principal challenge remains my area of expertise and interest. At issue was, and still is, how to communicate the essence of medieval France in the 12th and 13th centuries without either overstressing its esoteric character or, conversely, without overstressing the perspective of today's world. In other words, I felt that my first task in teaching the Middle Ages to an undergraduate public was to modernize that period such that it would speak to my audience, but to do so without altering its cultural significance. So I come to the second point of my presentation, the psychology of learning. A principle that guided me as I attempted to develop courses dealing with medieval France was my profound conviction that any period of history has something to teach us, even if that period seems at first glance alien and remote. In preparing courses designed for an undergraduate audience, I thus attempted to select that something which could be representative of the culture of medieval France in its specificity, and at the same time, which could still be relevant in today's world. In short, I proceeded to select themes and topics that could have both a specific value in reference to my area of research and a universal value in reference to the problems and issues that are integral to any community at any given moment of history. So A, how to select a course topic. And let me hasten to add that the selection of those themes and topics was a slow process, and that my pedagogic methods are the result of trial and error. I should also say that my selection of topics for undergraduate courses was not and is not determined by the fact that the topic is easy to study or easy to communicate. For I am convinced that the best research, the best writing, and the best teaching are those that are inspired by a love for the subject matter. I am convinced that communication between teacher and students succeeds to the extent of the teacher's fascination for the subject that he or she is presenting. And finally, I also hold the conviction that undergraduates at Stanford, regardless of their respective disciplines and fields of study, have the capacity to understand and react to the most esoteric topics of exploration. So the example that I will use as my illustration today is a course I began developing a number of years ago. And the chief reason that I decided to offer a course on sanctity in the medieval period was that I had done extensive work on the subject. Indeed, my first area of research as a medievalist was the study of French hagiography, specifically the study of those saints' lives that were composed in verse during the 12th and 13th centuries. And looking back, I realized that it was not a very wise choice of research topic, considering the then total disinterest on the part of scholars and publishers for that specific cultural manifestation. But I was interested in the subject, regardless of its unpopularity, just as I was interested in communicating the result of my explorations, regardless of the popularity or potential lack thereof of a course on old French hagiography. In proposing a course on that particular topic, I was thus quite prepared to attract only a very small number of students. Yet I believe that sanctity was one of those topics that hold both a specific and a universal value, and therefore that studying medieval hagiography could introduce students to a profoundly characteristic aspect of French culture in the 12th and 13th centuries, while at the same time inviting them to reflect on a concept, perfection, in both its religious and secular manifestations during and after the Middle Ages. With this in mind, I proceeded to gather the materials for my course. And we are here talking of a series of documents composed in Old French verse, documents which in their original form were obviously inaccessible to the average undergraduate. Thus, my first task was to translate those texts into modern English. And in the course of doing that task, I quickly realized that I was working both as translator and, significantly, as adapter. And this realization helped me prepare for one of the challenges posed by my discipline, which I mentioned earlier, regarding the necessity of respecting the spirit of the original, while also modernizing it such that it becomes readable for a contemporary audience. So B, what knowledge to transmit? My main concern at this point was, of course, my future public, small as it might be. To prepare my course on medieval saints' lives, as well as any other similar courses, I kept in mind the participants who might decide to enroll. What would interest them? What types of issues would be pertinent from their perspective? What experience could possibly render my subject matter relevant to them? And now we have to consider the fact that medieval saints' life constitute a body of knowledge that is, to say the least, extremely unfamiliar to most students. Because most of those saints' lives, because most of the students know little or nothing about the Middle Ages from the cultural or historical viewpoint. Because most of the students know little or nothing about the cult of the saints within the history of the Church. Because most of them know little or nothing about sanctity as a phenomenon of institutionalized religion. And because most of them know little or nothing about hagiography as a specific literary genre. Not to mention the origin and development of French literature, the place and role of hagiography within that development, the difference between verse and prose and its relevance regarding the public addressed, or the difference between Latin and the vernacular as vehicles of knowledge and communication in the Middle Ages. Recognizing the difficulty of reading and analyzing texts without the proper historical and cultural background, I decided to organize a course reader that would present not only the documents in their English translation, but also a series of introductions that would provide pertinent information on each document, such as its date, area of origin, authorship if known, intended public, prosodic form, etc. And the point here was to introduce the students to the subject matter in its specificity. That is, to invite them to an exploration of the place, meaning and function of vernacular hagiographic poems in 12th and 13th century France. But just as important, in my perspective, is to introduce the students to the subject matter in its universality. In other words, I wanted them to discover an aspect of cultural history with which they are for the most part unfamiliar, but I also wanted them to internalize that discovery and to relate the subject matter to their own life experience or culture or personal interest. And I talked a while ago about the trial and error approach through which I came to develop my course on medieval saints. So let me interrupt my narration for a moment and engage in a retrospective summary of my experience. To date, I have offered this course a number of times, but it is never the same course, to the extent that it is never the same public. Thus, while the exploration of medieval sanctity remains the principal goal of the course, I also try to adapt the subject matter according to the students' needs and interests. Because the important point here, I believe, is not to impose my knowledge or my perspective on the subject matter, so much as it is to inspire my audience to develop or deepen their knowledge and their perspective. On the first day of class, I generally distribute a handout on which students are asked to state briefly their goals and expectations for this course. Those statements help me adapt my syllabus immediately, if need be, or for a future class. Also of help are the evaluations that students write at the end of the course. It is obviously impossible to satisfy each of those needs and implement each of those suggestions, which, are at times contradictory. For example, one student will note that there should be more lectures and less discussion, but another student will note that there should be fewer lectures and more discussion. Nonetheless, those statements and evaluations are useful as a sounding board of what students want to learn, or did learn, or would like to learn in a course. So C, how best to transmit knowledge. To resume my narration and return to the moment when I began developing the course on medieval sense lives, the next issue I considered was how to help my audience analyze those documents in both their specific and universal interest. How best to engage the students in an exploration of the subject matter. And what means could I use to inspire each of them to relate those medieval illustrations of sanctity to his or her personal views, experience, and interest. Indeed, I am profoundly convinced that one of the goals in teaching a course such as medieval sanctity that deals with a concept pertaining to the humanities in general is to induce students to reflect on the values of today's world via a comparative and contrasting exploration of the values operative during a different era in a different society. But this should not only be an individual exploration, it should also be a collective exchange engaging the entire class. Indeed, by psychology of teaching and learning, I refer not only to the type of knowledge that each student may obtain from the course, but also to the methods for best communicating that knowledge. And of course, the key word here is communication. After so many years devoted to the study of medieval hagiography, I have, of course, developed a specific theory about the meaning and function of the cult of the saints. And I do offer my theory in the course of the lectures I give to the class. Yet, as I said a while ago, I consider the student's own perspective as important and as valid as mine if it is couched in a coherent and convincing fashion. And this is why I insist on the importance of students' participation, which takes the form of a dialogue among themselves during discussion time, and written assignments, which take the form of a concluding section in their papers, in which they are invited to enlarge the topic and establish a contrast or a comparison between then, the Middle Ages, and now. And to foster students' participation and to facilitate this collective dialogue, I decided to include in the course reader a series of issues and questions pertaining to each document. Issues whose purpose was to guide the students in their reading of the texts, as well as to help their preparation for discussion time. Indeed, oral participation was, and still is, an important part of the coursework. Not only are students expected to participate actively in the discussion time, they are also asked to act as discussion leaders. More specifically, they are asked each to sign up as member of the discussion team that will lead the class exploration of the reading or readings assigned on a given day. And my idea in organizing those discussion teams was that a dialogue led by students is bound to elicit the maximum of collective participation to the extent that it alleviates the intimidation factor. Also, students get to know one another, both in the preparation as discussion leaders and in their participation in the discussion group, and this contributes to their capacity to express themselves. I thus planned my course time such that it be more or less equally divided between lectures delivered to the entire class and discussion sections, each led by a small group of students. Ideally, the reading assigned on a given day is discussed first, and only after those discussions do I give a lecture that both recapitulates the students' findings and proposes my own interpretation of the text. Having completed the material and conceptual organization of my course, I entered the classroom with my course reader in hand and some trepidation, because I was more than ever aware of the esoteric character of my subject and was also in total darkness as to what responses and reactions it could inspire. And I come to the final part of my presentation, dealing with an eclectic audience. Coming to the end of my narration, when I entered the classroom on the very first day of my teaching this course, I found, expectedly, a small audience. And this remained the case for a number of years. And since the main title of my course was, and still is, Female Saints, my audience was generally composed of between 8 and 12 women students. Interestingly, one of those students remarked in her end of course evaluation that this course should be open to male students, as if the female character of the audience was the result of some gender-related restriction. In any case, taking the character of my audience into consideration, I emphasized the interest and relevance of the portrayal of sainthood, specifically of the female saints commemorated in medieval time, from a woman's perspective. I also included in the course reader suggested issues for discussion that focused on the role of violence in the making of a female saint, on the centrality of the disrobed body in those stories, and on the comparative function of violence and divestment in the context of contemporary mores in relation to, say, rape, incest, and pornography. And this until the day in recent years when I entered the room for the first class meeting and saw literally hundreds of students. I do not believe for 1 minute that I had suddenly, by some miracle, become popular, or that sanctity was suddenly a cool subject. There are concrete factors, some having to do with current distribution requirements, that explain more plausibly the presence of this large crowd. Be that as it may, I was facing a new challenge: sheer number of students, diversity of disciplines, of expectations, of individual experiences, of cultural backgrounds. In some haste, because time was of the essence, I adapted my syllabus and changed the materials in the course reader in an attempt to satisfy the various needs and interests of this new public. And the experience proved to be both exhausting, and I must confess that enrollment in this course is now limited to 50, and exhilarating. Computing technology enabled us to identify each of the nearly 300 students who decided eventually to enroll in that course. Somewhat to my surprise, they were from all disciplines imaginable, as many or even more from the scientific field than from the humanities, from origins as diverse as India, Pakistan, Asia, Africa, South America, and as many men as women. This was no longer a Eurocentric, female-oriented endeavor. In that context, attending the discussion sections and correcting papers became all the more fascinating as students came from different cultural horizons, functioned according to different social values, and adhered to different religious systems of belief. In short, diversity was now the name of the game. But diversity being a somewhat loaded term nowadays, I prefer to talk about eclecticism. How was I to respond to the needs of this eclectic audience? What did those students expect from a course on medieval saints' lives? Reading the statements they wrote in the goals and expectations sheets on the first day, I discovered that for what this eclectic audience had in common was the search for values, which they associated with sanctity. And that, regardless of their respective religious backgrounds, they each had a very specific notion of the manner in which an individual reaches the state of sainthood. Thus, I saw my task as one of the mystificator, to the extent that notion of sainthood was based on a somewhat rigid, monolithic, intransigent, and non-historical image of perfection. In other words, my task, and the task of my wonderful TAs, was to teach this eclectic audience how to read a text without any preconceived ideas, how to situate a given document within its social, cultural, and historical context, how to analyze objectively rather than subjectively the textual illustration of sainthood provided in our readings, how to decipher the strategies by means of which an author conveys his idea of perfection, how to conceptualize the narrative elements in the text instead of blaming the medieval author for failing to present a convincing story, how to assess the value of the saintly protagonist as hero instead of assessing his or her value as potential contemporary role model. And it appears that the subject matter, sainthood, was ideally suited for this demystifying approach to our documents, precisely because those function as a sort of propaganda whose goal was to remind their medieval audiences of the dangers of sin and of the necessity to obey God's, that is, the Church's, commands. Thus, the attempt was to learn together how to recognize the function of a given document, like those medieval saints' lives, which reflect the fears and hopes of a society at a given moment of its history. This aspect of our dialogue covered the specific significance of vernacular hagiography in the context of Northern Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. To the text already included in the course reader, I added as reading materials other hagiographic documents, either written in Latin as opposed to Old French, or relating the life of a real, authentic saint as opposed to the mostly fictional saints commemorated in Old French verse, or relating the life of a contemporary saint as opposed to the mostly ancient martyrs and hermits celebrated in Old French verse. This second source of documentation enabled the students to differentiate between the concept of sainthood as defined by the medieval church, the achievement of historically authentic saints during the medieval period, and the function of the mostly fictional saints commemorated in the Old French tradition. And to further our exploration of sainthood in its universality, students were invited to write their second paper in the form of a comparison between one of the holy characters of medieval hagiography and a non-medieval character of their choice, be it a Christian or a non-Christian saint, or be it a character from secular fiction or even cinema. It is a measure of the sophistication of our undergraduate population at Stanford to note that students in that course proved to become experts in deconstructing a typical Old French saint's life. Whereas this eclectic audience had manifested at first a tendency toward rigidity, intolerance, and intransigence, it demonstrated a gradual ability to tolerate difference, to accept other norms of behavior, and also to explore the significance of the universal need for role models, even if those models happen to be inimitable, or, as the case may be, less than admirable. This eclectic audience ended in showing also a capacity to recognize the stereotypical character of the heroes celebrated in any and all cultures, even when those heroes are presented as saints. And this acquired expertise on the part of the students was nowhere better displayed than in the performances staged by them at the end of the course. The idea was to offer them a choice of final exam. They could either write a take-home essay on a particular aspect of medieval hagiography, as analyzed in the course of the quarter, or they could gather in groups, concoct together a typical saint's life, and present it on stage, with the understanding that they were to adhere to the rules of the hagiographic genre as it developed in medieval France, and that they were to submit the script of their play. The result was an amazingly intelligent, not to mention entertaining, series of performances that were evidence of the students' capacity to distance themselves from the subject matter, as well as to treat the issues involved in it. In other words, they proved to have understood quite well, through our exploration of medieval hagiography, an essential lesson in life, namely that one must take things and others seriously, but oneself not too seriously. And in this experience, I have learned that an eclectic audience does not necessarily mean diversity of opinions with respect to one's conception of the world order. In that respect, age, rather than race, nation, language, or religion, is a primary factor. The students enrolled in that course were all eager to learn more, as they wrote in their statements on the first day, about values. I respected their desire, but my way of satisfying it was to try to show them the infinitely fluctuating and unstable significance of the word value. Through our exploration of the sense of all French hagiography, we discovered or rediscovered together that an important value, at least with respect to interaction and communication, is to approach the world with as much objectivity as possible. Subjectively speaking, however, my view of teaching focuses on my rapport with students. What I attempt to do is to create an atmosphere of collegiality most conducive to a fruitful exchange of ideas and opinions. My goal is to help each of them develop his or her capacity both to analyze a document, regardless of its origin, and to synthesize his or her findings, both orally and in writing. As a member of the School of Humanities, I see my role as that of a guide whose task is to lead the student through the maze of textuality, such that he or she can decipher any given document from any given period of history and understand the motivations that inspire that document. And I welcome the opportunity to attract, at times, large and eclectic audiences, because it is always rewarding to prove to our techies that the term humanities does not apply strictly to a specific school, but rather that it refers to the community at large, of which we are all equally members. In my teaching experience, it exists no visible difference between techies and fuzzies, in part because the phenomenon of medieval sainthood is neither scientific nor literary in a modern sense of those terms, and in part because, as I discovered to my surprise, sainthood is one of those concepts that appears nowadays to fascinate a great variety of undergraduates, who thus find a forum where they can reassess the common elements that bring together an eclectic community, such as the Stanford community, and where they can practice and develop the universal language of dialogue. A final note to close this brief account of my experience with this course on sanctity. There is a French saying that goes, a sad saint is a bad saint. In facing the formidable challenge that is constitutive of the subject matter like medieval sanctity, I find that humor is very useful. Some of the stories we read and discuss are indeed amusingly outrageous. At other times, it is I who make students laugh, not that I am particularly funny, but because of my unintentional linguistic gaffe. For example, how to pronounce hair in the case of saints who never shaved, as opposed to heir in the case of saints who rejected their inheritance. Teaching an eclectic audience is inspiring and fun, and what I am trying to achieve is to make learning fun and inspiring too. Thank you very much.